In a city that never sleeps, amidst the glittering skyscrapers and unyielding chaos of New York, it's easy to lose sight of the human stories unfolding in its shadows. Here, wealth and privilege can walk side by side with poverty and despair, often separated by no more than a few blocks. It's a place where lives can collide in the most unexpected ways. A moment of chance, a test of character, and perhaps a reminder of what truly matters. For Jonathan Reed, a tech mogul turned philanthropist, life had become a pursuit of purpose rather than profit. And for his daughter Emma, turning 18 in the lap of luxury felt like a rite of passage she took for granted. But one seemingly trivial event, a lost wallet, would set off a chain reaction, intertwining their lives with those of people they'd never imagined meeting. What started as a day of frustration would transform into a journey of redemption, resilience, and the undeniable power of kindness. The summer sun blazed down on Harlem's bustling streets, where the hum of life was almost tangible. Vendors called out to passers-by, selling everything from fresh produce to second-hand clothes, while children played on the sidewalks, their laughter blending with the distant rhythm of a street musician's saxophone. Jonathan Reed stood out among the crowd, his tailored suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to the surroundings. Beside him, his daughter Emma shuffled uncomfortably, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Dad, I don't get why we're here," she said, her voice tinged with irritation. "This was supposed to be my birthday weekend, not some community outreach project." Jonathan sighed, adjusting his tie. "Emma, it's not just about you. I wanted you to see a different side of the city. Not everyone has the privileges you do." Emma rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath. She had envisioned a weekend filled with spa treatments and fine dining, not wandering through a neighborhood she'd only heard about in news reports. The father and daughter strolled down the street, drawing occasional glances. Jonathan seemed unbothered, even smiling warmly at a young boy who darted past them with a basketball. Emma, however, kept a wary eye on their surroundings, clutching her designer handbag, as if it might vanish at any moment. "Can we at least stop somewhere with air conditioning?" Emma asked. "We're almost done," Jonathan replied. "I want to visit the community center a few blocks away. They're doing some great work here." Emma's groan was interrupted by a commotion at the corner. A man on a bicycle had collided with a fruit vendor's cart, sending apples and oranges rolling into the street. Jonathan instinctively bent down to help the vendor, earning a grateful smile. Emma, meanwhile, checked her phone, oblivious to the small crowd that had gathered. As they continued walking, Jonathan patted his pockets, his expression shifting from calm to concern. "Emma, have you seen my wallet?" he asked, stopping in his tracks. Emma looked up from her phone, frowning. "What? Number when did you last have it?" Jonathan retraced his steps in his mind. "I paid for something at the corner market. That must have been the last time." Emma's irritation flared. "Seriously, Dad? You're walking around here with all your cash and cards, and you lose your wallet?" "Let's not jump to conclusions," Jonathan said, scanning the sidewalk. "It could have fallen out somewhere." Emma glanced around skeptically. "Yeah, or someone picked your pocket. This place isn't exactly Fifth Avenue." Jonathan gave her a pointed look. "Emma, not everyone is out to get you. Sometimes people surprise you." But even Jonathan couldn't hide his unease as they doubled back, asking shopkeepers and passers-by if anyone had seen a wallet. Each inquiry was met with a shake of the head or a polite, "No, sorry." By the time they returned to their car, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. Emma slumped into her seat with an exasperated sigh. "Great. Just great. Now what?" Do we cancel everything because you lost your wallet? Jonathan ignored her tone, staring out the window as the cityscape blurred past. No, he said quietly. We go back to the hotel and wait. If someone found it, they'll do the right thing. Emma snorted. Sure, because that's how the world works. Back at the St. Regis, Jonathan filed a report with the hotel staff and the local police, though he held little hope of recovering his wallet. Emma, meanwhile, vented her frustrations to her friends over the phone, pacing the room as she recounted the day's events. Hours later, as the city settled into its nocturnal rhythm, Jonathan sat by the window, sipping a glass of water. His phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. Hello. A young, slightly nervous voice came through the line. Hi. Is this Jonathan Reed? I think I have your wallet. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. Yes, it is. Who am I speaking with? My name's Tommy, the voice replied. I found it earlier today. I can bring it to you if you want. Where are you now? Jonathan asked. Tommy rattled off an address, and Jonathan's stomach tightened. It was in a part of the city he hadn't ventured into for years, a place known for its struggles with poverty and crime. Thank you, Tommy, Jonathan said. I'll come to you. Emma, overhearing the conversation, looked up in alarm. Wait, what? You're not seriously going there, are you? Jonathan smiled faintly. Sometimes, Emma, you have to trust people. Not everything is a trap. Emma crossed her arms. You're bringing security, right? This isn't some feel-good movie. Things happen. Jonathan sighed but nodded. Fine. If it'll make you feel better. As they prepared to leave, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter would be more than just retrieving a wallet. Little did he know, it would be the first step in a journey that would change their lives forever. The soft hum of luxury filled the suite at the St. Regis Hotel. Plush carpeting muffled every step, and the city's distant hustle was reduced to a whisper behind soundproof windows. Yet, the air was tense. Emma paced back and forth, her designer sneakers scuffing lightly against the floor, while Jonathan sat on the velvet armchair, tapping his fingers against the glass coffee table. Dad, this is ridiculous, Emma said, her tone sharp. We've been back for hours. That wallet is long gone. It's time to accept it and move on. Jonathan leaned back, his calm demeanor unshaken. Emma, sometimes people surprise you. Not everyone sees a lost wallet as an opportunity to take advantage. Emma scoffed. You're way too optimistic. This isn't some feel-good story. Whoever has it is probably shopping with your credit cards by now. Jonathan gave her a faint smile. Well, that's what fraud protection is for. Their conversation was interrupted by the sharp buzz of Jonathan's phone vibrating against the glass. The screen lit up with an unknown number. Emma stopped pacing, her arms crossed as she watched her father pick up the phone. Hello? Jonathan's voice was steady, though a flicker of hope glimmered in his eyes. Hi. Is this Jonathan Reed? A young, hesitant voice came through the line. I think I have your wallet. Jonathan straightened in his chair, his heart quickening. Yes, it is. Who am I speaking with? My name's Tommy, the boy replied. I found it earlier today. I can bring it to you if you want. Jonathan glanced at Emma, who raised an eyebrow skeptically. Where are you now, Tommy? Tommy hesitated before answering, his voice quieter. I'm in Harlem, near 145th Street. It's a little far from you, I think. Emma's face immediately hardened. No way, she whispered sharply, though Jonathan waved her off. It's not far, Jonathan said into the phone. Thank you for reaching out. I'll come to you. Tommy seemed taken aback. Really? You don't want me to come to you? No, it's no trouble. Can you text me the exact address? Jonathan asked. There was a pause before Tommy agreed. Okay, I'll send it now. Thanks. When the call ended, Jonathan looked up to find Emma staring at him, her expression a mix of disbelief and frustration. You can't seriously be thinking about going there, she said. Why not? Jonathan replied calmly, slipping his phone into his pocket. Did you hear the address? That's not exactly the safest part of the city, Emma said. You're going to walk into a trap. Or worse. Jonathan's voice softened. Emma, he's just a kid. He sounded nervous, polite even. He went out of his way to call me. Why assume the worst? Emma threw her hands up in exasperation. Because that's reality, Dad. Not everyone's out to help you. And even if he is, what if someone else sees you as an easy target? Jonathan chuckled softly. That's what the bodyguard is for. Emma's eyes widened. You're actually taking me with you? I thought you were smarter than this. Jonathan stood, slipping on his jacket. I'm going, Emma. You can come if you want, or stay here. But if this kid found my wallet, he deserves to be treated with trust and respect. Emma stared at him for a moment, before sighing heavily. Fine. But if this turns into a disaster, don't say I didn't warn you. The streets of Midtown Manhattan gradually gave way to Harlem's livelier, grittier energy. The polished facades of skyscrapers and high-end boutiques faded into modest brownstones, corner stores, and bustling markets. Inside the black SUV, Emma sat stiffly, her gaze flitting nervously between the passing scenes outside the window. I don't get it, she muttered. Why are you so calm? This place doesn't exactly scream safe. Jonathan, seated beside her, looked up from his phone. Emma, you're judging an entire neighborhood based on its appearance. That's not fair. Emma crossed her arms, leaning back against the seat. It's not just the appearance, Dad. It's the stories you hear, the crime, the scams. Jonathan gave her a knowing look. And how many people here have you actually met? Emma opened her mouth to respond, but quickly shut it, rolling her eyes instead. She turned her attention back to the window, her fingers tapping anxiously against her knee. The SUV slowed as it entered a quieter street, lined with small apartment buildings and fading murals. The bodyguard in the driver's seat spoke for the first time. We're close. Do you want me to go in first, sir? Jonathan shook his head. No, thank you. Stay with the car in case we need to leave quickly. Emma's heart raced as the SUV came to a stop in front of an aging building. The streetlights cast long shadows across the cracked pavement. A figure emerged from a nearby doorway. A young boy, no older than 13, skinny and slightly hunched. He approached cautiously, clutching something tightly in his hands. That must be him, Jonathan said, stepping out of the car before Emma could protest. Are you Mr. Reed? Tommy asked, his voice tentative. His wide eyes darted nervously between Jonathan and the SUV. Jonathan smiled warmly. I am. You must be Tommy. The boy nodded, holding out the wallet. Here. I didn't take anything, I swear. Jonathan took the wallet, opening it briefly to confirm everything was intact. Thank you, Tommy. You have no idea how much trouble you've saved me. Emma, who had reluctantly stepped out of the car, stood a few feet away, her arms crossed. That's it? You're just handing it over? Tommy blinked at her, confused. Yeah. I didn't steal it. Emma's eyes narrowed. So, why'd you bother calling? What's in it for you? Emma, Jonathan scolded, his tone firm. Tommy looked down, shuffling his feet. I I just thought it was the right thing to do, he said quietly. I didn't want to take anything that wasn't mine. Jonathan's expression softened. You did the right thing, Tommy, and I'm grateful for that. Tommy hesitated before speaking again. Could I, um, could I maybe have a few dollars? I used my last change to call you. Emma rolled her eyes. There it is. I knew it. Jonathan shot her a warning look before turning back to Tommy. Of course. Here. He pulled a $20 bill from his wallet and handed it to the boy. Get yourself something to eat. Tommy's face lit up. Thank you, sir. Really. As they returned to the car, Emma remained silent, her thoughts swirling. For the first time she began to wonder if she had misjudged the boy. And perhaps much more. The SUV rolled through Harlem's dimly lit streets, leaving behind the soft glow of Midtown's skyline. The farther they drove, the more the environment changed. Ornate streetlights gave way to flickering bulbs, pristine sidewalks turned to cracked pavement, and storefronts shifted from high-end boutiques to bodegas with graffiti-tagged shutters. Inside the car, Emma sat stiffly, her hands tightly gripping her phone. Every honk, every shout, and every motorcycle roar from the street outside seemed to make her flinch. This is insane, she muttered, shooting a glare at her father. You seriously think this is a good idea? Jonathan leaned back in his seat, gazing calmly out the window. Emma, sometimes the best decisions don't feel safe at first. Emma rolled her eyes, her frustration bubbling over. Right, because trusting a random kid to give back your wallet in the middle of the night screams good decision. Jonathan glanced at her, a faint smile playing on his lips. You could stand to trust people more. Emma crossed her arms, turning her attention back to her phone. And you could stand to trust people less. The car slowed as the streets grew narrower, passing rows of aging brownstones and apartment complexes. At one corner, a group of teenagers lingered under a dim streetlight, their laughter echoing into the night. A few of them glanced at the SUV as it passed, their expressions unreadable. Emma shrank back into her seat. Okay, I've seen enough movies to know this is the part where things go wrong. Jonathan chuckled softly. Emma, this isn't a movie. It's real life. And not everyone out here is looking to cause trouble. The bodyguard seated in the driver's seat cut in. Sir, we're getting close. It's just ahead. Emma looked out the window as the car came to a stop. The building they had arrived at was old, its bricks darkened with years of grime. A single bulb illuminated the entrance, casting long shadows on the crumbling steps. Jonathan opened his door and stepped out, his polished shoes crunching softly on the pavement. Emma hesitated, glancing nervously at the shadowy alley nearby. Are you coming? Jonathan asked, leaning back into the car. Emma shook her head. Nope. I'll wait here. Jonathan sighed, giving her a patient smile. Suit yourself. As he approached the building, a figure emerged from the shadows near the doorway. It was the boy from earlier, Tommy. He looked even younger in person, his skinny frame dwarfed by the oversized hoodie he wore. He clutched the wallet in his hands, his wide eyes darting nervously between Jonathan and the SUV. You must be Tommy, Jonathan said, his voice warm and reassuring. The boy nodded, holding out the wallet. Here. I didn't take anything. I promise. Jonathan took the wallet, flipping it open to check the contents. Cash, credit cards, even the small photo of Emma as a toddler. Everything was intact. He looked back at Tommy, his expression one of genuine gratitude. Thank you, Tommy, Jonathan said. You have no idea how much this means to me. Tommy shifted on his feet, looking down at the ground. It's nothing, sir. I just Thought you'd want it back." From inside the car, Emma watched the exchange through narrowed eyes. She couldn't hear the conversation, but the sight of her father smiling and shaking Tommy's hand only made her more suspicious. "Great," she muttered to herself. "Now he's bonding with the kid. What's next? Inviting him to dinner?" Unable to contain her frustration, Emma opened the door and stepped out, crossing her arms as she approached the pair. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her tone sharp. Jonathan glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. "Emma, this is Tommy. He's the one who returned my wallet." Emma looked at Tommy, her gaze skeptical. "Uh-huh. And what's the catch? What do you want in return?" Tommy blinked, taken aback. "I don't want anything. I just thought it was the right thing to do." Emma rolled her eyes. "Right. Because that's how the world works." "Emma," Jonathan said firmly, his tone a warning. Tommy hesitated before speaking again, his voice quieter this time. "Well, I did have to use my last bit of change to call you. So maybe, if it's okay, could I have a couple of dollars, just enough to buy some bread?" Emma let out a sharp laugh. "There it is. I knew it." Jonathan sighed, shaking his head. "Emma, enough." He reached into his wallet and pulled out a $20 bill, handing it to Tommy. "Here, get yourself something to eat." Tommy's eyes widened. "Really? Thank you, sir." Jonathan smiled. "No, Tommy. Thank you." As they returned to the car, Emma stayed behind for a moment, watching as Tommy disappeared back into the building. For the first time that evening, doubt crept into her thoughts. Had she been too quick to judge? Was it possible that the boy's intentions were genuine? She didn't have long to dwell on the questions. Jonathan was already calling her back to the car, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "Come on, Emma," he said. "Let's get back to the hotel." The journey back to Midtown was quieter. Emma sat silently in the back seat, staring out the window as the lights of the city blurred past. Jonathan, sensing her mood, didn't press her for conversation. Instead, he gazed out his own window, lost in thought. When they finally arrived at the hotel, Emma spoke up for the first time since leaving Harlem. "Do you really think he was telling the truth?" she asked. Jonathan looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I do. And even if he wasn't, what's the harm in believing?" Emma didn't respond. Instead, she nodded slightly, her gaze drifting back to the city outside. For the first time, she wondered if her father's optimism wasn't as naive as she'd thought. The next morning, Jonathan found himself unable to stop thinking about the boy. There had been something in Tommy's eyes, a mix of fear and hope, that struck a chord deep within him. It reminded Jonathan of his own youth, of a time when the world had felt just as uncertain and unforgiving. As he sipped his coffee in the quiet of the hotel suite, his thoughts were interrupted by Emma, emerging from her room, her hair tied up in a messy bun, and her expression groggy. "Morning," she muttered, reaching for the orange juice on the counter. "Morning," Jonathan replied. He hesitated before continuing. "I'm going back today." Emma paused mid-pour, looking at him incredulously. "Back where?" "To Tommy's neighborhood," Jonathan said. "I want to learn more about him and his family." Emma set the juice down with a sigh. "Dad, we got your wallet back. Why can't you just leave it at that?" Jonathan gave her a patient smile. "Because sometimes, Emma, doing the right thing means doing more than just saying thank you." Emma groaned, throwing herself onto the couch. "You're impossible." "Come with me," Jonathan said, his tone gentle but firm. "It might change how you see things." Emma groaned again, but didn't argue further. She knew better than to try to talk him out of something, once he'd made up his mind. By late morning, Jonathan and Emma were back in the SUV, retracing their route to Tommy's apartment building. The streets were livelier in the daylight, with vendors setting up shop and children playing in the alleys. Emma glanced out the window, taking in the scene with a mix of curiosity and unease. As they pulled up in front of Tommy's building, Jonathan turned to Emma. "Ready?" Emma shrugged, her expression guarded. "Let's just get this over with." The door creaked loudly as they stepped into the dimly lit lobby. The smell of mildew and something faintly metallic filled the air. Jonathan led the way up the narrow staircase, each step groaning under their weight. When they reached Tommy's door, Jonathan knocked softly. After a moment, the door opened a crack, and Tommy's face appeared. His eyes widened when he saw them. "Mr. Reed?" Tommy asked, his voice laced with surprise. "Hi, Tommy," Jonathan said warmly. "I was hoping we could talk a bit more, if that's okay." Tommy hesitated, glancing over his shoulder before nodding. "Okay, but my mom's sick. She's sleeping?" Jonathan nodded understandingly as Tommy opened the door fully, allowing them inside. The apartment was small, no more than 2 rooms. The main area served as a living room, kitchen, and bedroom all in one, with a battered couch and a fold-out table taking up most of the space. A curtain hung across a doorway, presumably leading to the other room. On the counter sat a half-empty box of cereal and a carton of milk, well past its expiration date. Emma wrinkled her nose, but said nothing as she followed Jonathan inside. "Sorry it's such a mess," Tommy said, shifting uncomfortably. "We don't have much." Jonathan shook his head. "You don't have to apologize, Tommy. Thank you for letting us in." Tommy gestured for them to sit on the couch while he pulled up a rickety chair. He sat with his hands fidgeting nervously in his lap. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her tone sharp. Jonathan started gently. "Tommy, you mentioned yesterday that your mom isn't well. Can you tell me more about what's going on?" Tommy hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "She's been sick for a while. I don't really know what's wrong, but she gets tired all the time. She used to work as a waitress, but she can't anymore." "And your sister?" Jonathan prompted. Tommy's expression softened. "Lily's 7. She's great, but it's been hard. I try to take care of her, but I'm only 13. Jonathan nodded, his heart aching for the boy. "Do you have any other family nearby?" Tommy shook his head. "Number my dad left before I was born. It's just us." As they spoke, the curtain across the doorway shifted, and a woman's voice called weakly, "Tommy!" "Who's here?" Tommy jumped up, rushing to the doorway. "It's okay, Mom. Just Mr. Reed. He's the guy I told you about." The curtain parted, revealing a frail woman in her mid-30s. Her face was pale, and her eyes were sunken, but she managed a small smile as she leaned heavily against the doorframe. "Hello, Mrs." Jonathan trailed off, realizing he didn't know her name. "Sarah," she said softly. "Sarah Carson. Thank you for whatever help you gave Tommy yesterday." Jonathan stood, moving closer but keeping a respectful distance. "It's nice to meet you, Sarah. Tommy did something remarkable by returning my wallet, and I just wanted to meet the family who raised such an honest boy." Sarah's smile faltered, and she shook her head. "I don't know about remarkable. We're just trying to get by." Jonathan's gaze softened. "That's exactly what makes it remarkable." Over the next hour, Sarah and Tommy shared more of their story. Sarah had been diagnosed with lupus 2 years earlier, forcing her to quit her job. They had been evicted from their last apartment when she fell behind on rent, and they'd been living here ever since, scraping by on what little government assistance they received. "I've tried to find work I can do from home, but most days I'm too tired," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Tommy's done more for this family than any 13-year-old should have too. Jonathan listened intently, his mind already working through ways he could help. Emma, meanwhile, sat quietly, her earlier skepticism giving way to something she couldn't quite name. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe just the uncomfortable realization that her assumptions about people like Tommy had been wrong. As they prepared to leave, Jonathan reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "Sarah, I want to help. I know some people who might be able to provide medical support and housing." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head. "I appreciate it, Mr. Reed, but we've learned not to rely on promises. They usually don't pan out." Jonathan placed the card gently on the table. "This isn't a promise, Sarah. It's a guarantee. I'll be back tomorrow to talk more." Tommy walked them to the door, his expression conflicted. "Thank you, Mr. Reed, for everything." Jonathan placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Tommy, you're a remarkable young man. Don't ever forget that." As they rode back to the hotel, Emma finally broke her silence. "That was intense." Jonathan glanced at her. "It was real, Emma. That's the world a lot of people live in." Emma stared out the window, her mind racing. "Do you really think you can help them?" Jonathan's voice was steady. "I don't think I can. I know I can." For the first time in days, Emma felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected: admiration. She didn't say it out loud, but in that moment, she was proud of her father. The following day, the sun rose over New York City, painting the skyline in hues of amber and gold. Inside the suite at the St. Regis, Jonathan stood by the window, sipping his coffee and lost in thought. The images of Tommy's cramped apartment and Sarah's frail figure replayed in his mind. It was a stark reminder of the disparity that existed within the same city, luxury and hardship existing side by side. Emma shuffled into the room, still in her pajamas. She glanced at her father, who was already dressed, his usual suit and tie, replaced with a more casual sweater and slacks. "Let me guess," she said, pouring herself a glass of orange juice. "You're going back." Jonathan turned to her with a faint smile. "You guessed right." Emma leaned against the counter, her expression wary. "And what exactly are you planning to do?" "I want to understand their situation better," Jonathan said simply. "If I'm going to help, I need to know what they need." Emma hesitated, her fingers drumming against the glass. "Fine, I'll come. But only because I don't trust you to be careful." Jonathan chuckled softly. "I'll take whatever reason you're willing to give." As they arrived in Harlem, the vibrancy of the neighborhood during the morning hours was unmistakable. Street vendors set up colorful stalls, selling fresh produce and trinkets, while children played hopscotch on the sidewalks. Yet, despite the apparent energy, there was an underlying tension, a sense of resilience born out of necessity. Jonathan and Emma made their way back to Tommy's apartment, this time greeted at the door by Lily. The 7-year-old's wide eyes lit up when she saw them, and she threw her arms around Jonathan's legs without hesitation. "Hi, Mr. Reed," she exclaimed, her small voice bright and cheerful. "Hello, Lily," Jonathan replied warmly, kneeling to her level. "How are you today?" "I'm good. Tommy said you might come back," she said, stepping aside to let them in. "Mommy's awake too." The interior of the apartment was just as Jonathan remembered, modest and cramped, but clean and organized, despite the evident lack of resources. Sarah was seated on the couch, her frail frame wrapped in a blanket. She offered a weak smile as they entered. "Mr. Reed, I didn't think you'd actually come back," Sarah said, her voice hoarse. Jonathan sat across from her, his expression kind but determined. "I told you I would, Sarah." And I meant it. As they spoke, Sarah shared more about her family's circumstances. She explained how she had worked as a waitress for years, saving what little she could to provide for her children. But when she was diagnosed with lupus, everything changed. The disease left her too exhausted and in pain to continue working, and the medical bills quickly drained her savings. "We used to live in a better place," Sarah said, her voice tinged with regret. "It wasn't much, but it was home. Then, when I couldn't pay the rent anymore, we ended up here." "And the landlord here?" Jonathan asked, his brows furrowing. Sarah hesitated, glancing toward the window, as if afraid someone might overhear. "He's difficult. He's raised the rent twice in the past year, and if we're late, he threatens to kick us out." Jonathan exchanged a glance with Emma, who looked visibly uncomfortable. "Has he ever followed through on those threats?" he pressed gently. Sarah nodded, her hands tightening around the blanket. "Not with us, but I've seen other families forced out. Once you're on the streets, there's no coming back." Their conversation was interrupted by Tommy, who had been sitting quietly by the window. "It's not just the landlord," he said, his voice low. Jonathan turned to him. "What do you mean?" Tommy hesitated, glancing at his mother before continuing. "There's this guy, Mick. He runs things around here. If you don't pay him, bad stuff happens." Jonathan's expression darkened. "Are you saying Mick extorts money from the tenants?" Tommy nodded, his face tense. "Yeah. He says it's for protection. But if you can't pay, he makes sure you regret it." Jonathan leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "Has Mick threatened your family?" Tommy hesitated, then nodded again. "Last week. He said if we didn't pay him by the end of the month, he'd take our stuff. Or worse." Sarah's face paled, and she reached for her son's hand. "Tommy, please, don't talk about this." Jonathan's voice was firm but gentle. "Sarah, if someone is threatening you and your children, we need to do something about it." Sarah shook her head, her eyes glistening with tears. "You don't understand. People who try to stand up to Mick, they don't last long." Jonathan placed a reassuring hand on Sarah's. "You're not alone in this, Sarah. I have resources, connections. Let me help." Sarah looked at him, doubt and hope warring in her expression. "Why would you do that for us?" Jonathan's voice softened. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because Tommy did something extraordinary by returning my wallet. Now it's my turn to do something for your family." Emma, who had been silently observing the exchange, finally spoke. "And if Mick finds out, what happens then?" Jonathan met her gaze, his eyes steady. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it." After leaving the apartment, Jonathan wasted no time in making calls. He contacted a nonprofit organization he supported, explaining the family's situation and requesting immediate assistance. By the time they returned to the hotel, he had arranged for a caseworker to visit Sarah's apartment the next day. Emma watched her father work, with a mix of admiration and apprehension. She had always known him to be generous, but this was different. This wasn't writing a check or donating to a cause. This was personal. "Do you really think you can fix this?" she asked, as they sat down for dinner in the hotel's restaurant. Jonathan looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "It's not about fixing everything, Emma. It's about making a difference where you can." Emma nodded slowly, her mind replaying the image of Tommy's hopeful eyes and Sarah's frail smile. For the first time, she began to understand why her father did what he did. Later that evening, as Jonathan prepared for bed, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an unknown number. "You don't belong here, Mr. Reed. Stay out of Harlem if you know what's good for you." Jonathan stared at the message, his jaw tightening. He knew the risks involved in helping Sarah's family, but this solidified his resolve. Whoever sent the message had underestimated him. The fight to help Sarah, Tommy, and Lily was only just beginning. The morning sun streamed through the curtains of Jonathan's suite, casting warm light over the room. The city below hummed with life, yet Jonathan's mind was consumed by the weight of the previous day. The anonymous message lingered in his thoughts, a reminder of the dangers involved in helping Sarah's family. Still, as he sipped his coffee, his determination remained steadfast. Across the room, Emma emerged from her bedroom, dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie. "You're still going through with this, aren't you?" she asked, her tone resigned but lacking the edge of defiance from before. Jonathan looked up from his phone. "I am. It's Lily's birthday today, and I promised Tommy I'd make it special." Emma hesitated, leaning against the counter. "You really think a party is going to fix everything?" Jonathan smiled faintly. "Number. But it's a start. Sometimes, Emma, small moments of joy can remind people that things can get better." Emma studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Fine. I'll help. But only because I don't want you doing something reckless." The day was a whirlwind of activity. Jonathan enlisted the help of his assistant to coordinate the logistics, ensuring every detail was perfect. A local nonprofit provided access to a small park near Sarah's apartment, and Jonathan arranged for decorations, a cake, and even a few gifts for Lily. Emma, despite her initial reluctance, found herself caught up in the preparations. She helped pick out a dress for Lily, carefully selecting one that was bright and cheerful. At one point, as she wrapped presents in the hotel suite, she glanced at her father. "You know," she said, her tone softer than usual, "this might actually be nice." Jonathan looked at her with a knowing smile. That's the idea. By late afternoon, the park had been transformed. Colorful balloons swayed in the breeze, and a table covered in a floral tablecloth held an array of food and drinks. A large chocolate cake sat in the center, adorned with "Happy Birthday, Lily" in bright icing. Families from the neighborhood began to gather, drawn by the sight of the festive setup. Children ran around, their laughter filling the air as they played tag and soccer. For many, it was a rare moment of celebration in a community often weighed down by struggle. Tommy arrived with Lily and Sarah, who looked visibly touched by the effort. Lily's eyes lit up when she saw the decorations, and she clung to her brother's hand, too shy to let go at first. "Wow," Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is amazing." Jonathan greeted them warmly, kneeling to Lily's level. "Happy birthday, Lily. Today is all about you." Lily smiled shyly, hiding her face in her brother's arm. Tommy chuckled, gently nudging her forward. "Go on, Lil. Say thank you." "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Emma watched from a distance, her arms crossed as she leaned against a tree. Despite herself, she couldn't help but smile at the sight. As the party continued, Emma found herself drawn into the activities. She helped the children with face painting, her initial awkwardness giving way to genuine enjoyment as they laughed and squealed with delight. At one point, she sat with Tommy under the shade of a tree, watching Lily play with the other kids. "She seems happy," Emma said, nodding toward Lily. Tommy smiled, his expression softening. "Yeah, it's been a while since she's had a day like this." Emma hesitated before asking, "What about you? When's the last time you had something like this?" Tommy shrugged. "I don't really think about it. As long as Lily's okay, that's all that matters." Emma studied him, surprised by the maturity in his words. "You're a good brother," she said quietly. Tommy glanced at her, his eyes earnest. I just want her to have a better life than this. The festive atmosphere was interrupted when a group of men appeared at the edge of the park. Their presence was immediately noticeable. They stood apart from the families, their postures tense and their expressions hard. Leading them was Mick, his sharp features and cold eyes scanning the crowd. Jonathan noticed them first, his smile fading as he straightened. He made his way toward them, his steps deliberate but calm. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. Mick smirked, crossing his arms. "Just checking out the charity case. Didn't realize you were the new Santa Claus." Jonathan held his ground. "It's Lily's birthday. If you're here to cause trouble, I suggest you leave." Mick's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Relax, Mr. Reed. We're just here to say hi. This is our neighborhood, after all." Jonathan didn't flinch. "Then you should know better than to ruin a child's birthday." For a moment, the tension was palpable. The two men locked in a silent standoff. Finally, Mick raised his hands in mock surrender. "Fine. Enjoy your party. But don't forget, you're a guest here." As Mick and his men walked away, Emma approached her father, her face pale. "Who was that?" "Trouble," Jonathan said quietly. "But nothing we can't handle." Despite the interruption, the party continued. Lily blew out the candles on her cake, her face glowing with happiness as the crowd sang to her. For a few hours, it was as if the weight of the world had lifted, replaced by laughter and hope. As the sun began to set, Tommy approached Jonathan, his expression serious. "Thank you for today. It meant a lot to Lily." Jonathan placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You don't have to thank me, Tommy. You and your family deserve this." Tommy hesitated before speaking again. I'm worried. About Mick. He doesn't like it when people stand up to him." Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Let me worry about Mick. You focus on taking care of your sister." Tommy nodded, though the fear in his eyes remained. As they returned to the hotel that evening, Emma finally broke the silence. "You're putting yourself in danger for them," she said, her voice low. Jonathan looked at her, his expression calm. "Sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks." Emma frowned, her gaze dropping to her lap. I don't want to see you get hurt." Jonathan smiled faintly. "I appreciate that, Emma, but I have to do this." For the first time, Emma didn't argue. Instead, she nodded, a small part of her beginning to understand. Late that night, as Jonathan prepared for bed, his phone buzzed with a new message. "You've made your point, Mr. Reed. But if you don't back off, you'll regret it." Jonathan stared at the screen, his resolve hardening. Whoever Mick was, he had underestimated the strength of a father, determined to protect not only his own child, but a family in desperate need. The fight was far from over. The next morning dawned with a chill in the air, an ominous contrast to the bright celebration the day before. Jonathan sat at the breakfast table in the hotel suite, his coffee untouched, as he read through the message on his phone again. The words were clear, their intent unmistakable. Back off. He wasn't surprised. It had been only a matter of time before Mick made his threats more personal. Across from him, Emma picked at her fruit salad, her eyes darting nervously toward him. She hadn't said much since the party, and Jonathan knew she was processing the events in her own way. "You're still going back, aren't you?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. Jonathan looked up, his expression steady. "Yes." Emma frowned, her frustration evident. "Dad, this is serious. What if Mick actually does something? He's not just some loudmouth. He has people who listen to him." "I know," Jonathan said quietly. "And that's exactly why we can't let him win. If we give in to fear, We're letting him control the lives of everyone in that neighborhood. Emma crossed her arms, her voice rising. And what if he hurts you? Or Tommy? Or Lily? What then? Jonathan reached across the table, placing a hand on hers. Emma, I'm not going to let that happen. I promise. She didn't respond, pulling her hand back and retreating into silence. When Jonathan and Emma arrived at Sarah's apartment later that morning, the atmosphere was tense. The front door was slightly ajar, and Tommy stood just inside, his face pale and his hands clenched into fists. Tommy, Jonathan called out as he stepped inside. What's going on? Tommy turned, his eyes blazing with anger. They were here. Mick's guys. They trashed the place. Jonathan's gaze swept the apartment. The furniture had been overturned. The few belongings the family had strewn across the floor. The couch was slashed, its stuffing spilling out like a wound. In the corner, Lily sat on a small stool, clutching her stuffed bear tightly, her eyes wide with fear. Sarah emerged from the bedrooms, her face pale but determined. They said it was a warning, she said, her voice trembling slightly. If we don't pay what we owe, they'll be back. And next time, it'll be worse. Jonathan's jaw tightened as he looked around. The message was clear. Mick wanted to send a warning not just to Sarah, but to anyone who might think of standing up to him. We're going to fix this, Jonathan said firmly, meeting Sarah's gaze. How? Sarah asked, her voice a mix of desperation and disbelief. You don't understand, Mr. Reed. Mick owns this neighborhood. No one stands up to him. Well, someone has to, Jonathan said. And it's going to start with me. Back at the hotel, Jonathan called an emergency meeting with Detective Laura Bennett, a contact he had made through his nonprofit work. Bennett was known for her integrity and her tireless efforts to fight corruption, but even she had struggled to make headway in neighborhoods like Mick's. Mick's been on our radar for years, Bennett said, leaning back in her chair as she sipped her coffee. But every time we get close, he finds a way to slip through our fingers. Witnesses won't testify. Evidence goes missing. It's like he's untouchable. Jonathan nodded, his expression grim. What about the police? Isn't there anything they can do? Bennett hesitated before responding. There are some good cops on the force, but Mick's got connections. People are scared to go after him. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Then we'll have to do it ourselves. Bennett raised an eyebrow. You're serious? Dead serious, Jonathan said. I'm not just going to stand by and let him terrorize that family, or anyone else in that neighborhood. Bennett studied him for a moment before nodding. Okay, but if we're going to take Mick down, we'll need more than just good intentions. We need a plan. That evening, as Jonathan worked on logistics with Bennett, Emma paced the hotel room, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the image of Lily clutching her bear, her small body trembling with fear. For the first time, Emma realized just how much her own privilege had shielded her from the harsh realities of life. Finally, she stopped pacing and turned to her father. I want to help, she said, her voice steady. Jonathan looked up from his laptop, surprised. Emma, I mean it, she interrupted. This isn't just about you anymore. You're right. Someone has to stand up to Mick. And if you're going to do it, then so am I. Jonathan studied her for a moment, his expression softening. You've already helped more than you realize, Emma. But this is dangerous. I know, she said. But if Tommy and Lily can live with this every day, the least I can do is try to make it better. Jonathan nodded slowly, pride flickering in his eyes. Okay, let's do this together. The following day, Jonathan and Bennett began gathering evidence against Mick, starting with Sarah's testimony. At first, Sarah was hesitant, terrified of the repercussions, but with Jonathan's reassurance, she agreed to share her story. Meanwhile, Emma worked with the local nonprofit to organize a community meeting. She spoke with residents, listening to their stories and encouraging them to come forward. It was slow, painstaking work, but gradually people began to open up. But Mick wasn't idle. That evening, as Jonathan and Emma returned to the apartment, they found a note taped to the door. "Leave now, or you'll regret it." Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Tommy stood by the window, watching the street below, while Sarah sat on the couch, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of tea. "They're watching us," Tommy said quietly. "I saw one of Mick's guys across the street earlier." Jonathan placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "We're not going anywhere, Tommy. This is your home, and we're going to fight for it." Determined to send a message of his own, Jonathan decided to confront Mick directly. With Bennett's support, he arranged a meeting at a neutral location, a community center on the edge of the neighborhood. The tension in the room was palpable as Jonathan and Mick faced off, their opposing worlds colliding. "You're making a mistake, Reed," Mick said, his voice low and menacing. "This isn't your fight." Jonathan met his gaze unflinchingly. "It is now, and I'm not backing down." Mick leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "You think you're some kind of hero? You don't know how things work around here." Jonathan's voice was calm but firm. "Maybe not, but I know that people like you only have power because good people are too scared to stand up to you. That ends now." For a moment the room was silent, the air charged with tension. Finally Mick stood, his expression cold. "You're playing a dangerous game, Reed, and you won't win." As Mick left, Jonathan turned to Bennett. "This is just the beginning." Later that night, as Jonathan reviewed the day's progress, his phone buzzed with another message. "Tick-tock, Reed. Time's running out." Jonathan stared at the screen, his resolve hardening. Mick was right about one thing. This was a dangerous game, but Jonathan was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The stakes had never been higher. The morning light filtered through the curtains of the hotel suite as Jonathan sat at the small dining table, deep in thought. His phone buzzed with updates from Detective Bennett, the nonprofit team, and his assistant, all working in tandem to piece together a plan to dismantle Mick's stranglehold on the neighborhood. Emma sat across from him, scrolling through her own phone. She glanced up at her father, her expression tinged with concern. "You didn't sleep much, did you?" she asked. Jonathan shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "Not when there's this much at stake." Emma hesitated before speaking. "Dad, are you sure about this? Mick doesn't seem like the kind of guy who backs down. What if this gets worse?" Jonathan met her gaze, his voice steady. "It might get worse before it gets better, Emma. But if we don't do something, it'll never get better." That afternoon, Jonathan and Emma met with Detective Bennett at a small diner on the edge of Harlem. Bennett had brought along 2 other officers she trusted, both of whom had experience dealing with organized crime in the city. "The good news," Bennett began, as she stirred her coffee, "is that Mick's operation isn't as airtight as he wants everyone to think. He's running a protection racket, but we've started tracking some of the money. It's messy. Cash payments, fake accounts, but it's enough to build a case." "And the bad news?" Jonathan asked. Bennett leaned forward, her expression grim. "The bad news is that Mick knows how to cover his tracks. He's smart, and he's got people on the inside. If we don't move carefully, he'll see us coming a mile away." Emma frowned. "So, what do we do?" Bennett glanced at Jonathan, her tone cautious. We need someone on the inside, someone who can gather evidence without raising suspicion. Jonathan's brows furrowed. You're suggesting undercover work? Bennett nodded. It's risky, but it's our best shot. Later that evening, Jonathan returned to Sarah's apartment with Emma and Bennett in tow. The mood was tense as they explained the situation to Sarah and Tommy. You want me to spy on Mick? Tommy asked, his voice rising in disbelief. Are you crazy? He'd kill me if he found out. We'd never ask you to do this without taking every precaution, Bennett assured him. But you're in a unique position. Mick already knows you. He won't suspect anything if you're careful. Sarah shook her head, her face pale. Absolutely not. He's just a boy. You can't ask him to do something so dangerous. Jonathan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Sarah, I would never put Tommy in harm's way. But if we don't stop Mick, he'll keep coming after your family and others. Tommy looked between his mother and Jonathan, conflict etched on his face. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. If it helps keep my mom and Lily safe, I'll do it. Tommy, no, Sarah protested, tears welling in her eyes. It's okay, Mom, Tommy said, his voice trembling but determined. I can handle it. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Bennett and her team worked with Tommy, teaching him how to gather information discreetly and recognize potential danger. Jonathan provided him with a small recording device, disguised as a keychain and a prepaid phone for emergencies. Emma, meanwhile, took on the role of Tommy's confidant, helping him practice what to say and how to stay calm under pressure. The two spent hours sitting on the apartment floor, running through scenarios until Tommy felt ready. You're braver than I was at your age, Emma admitted one evening, her voice soft. Tommy smiled faintly. I'm just doing what I have to. The day Tommy approached Mick's crew was one of the longest of Jonathan's life. He, Emma, and Bennett waited anxiously at a nearby cafe, their phones within arm's reach in case something went wrong. Tommy returned hours later, his face pale, but his eyes sharp. He handed Bennett a small notebook filled with notes and details about Mick's operation. They didn't suspect anything, Tommy said, his voice shaking slightly. I just asked questions like I was curious. They actually bragged about some of the stuff they've done. Bennett flipped through the notebook, her expression impressed. This is good work, Tommy. Really good. Jonathan placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder, his voice filled with pride. You did great, Tommy. I'm proud of you. But Mick wasn't oblivious for long. A few days later, Sarah's apartment was vandalized again, this time more violently. Windows were shattered, and a threatening message was spray-painted on the wall. Stay in your lane. Jonathan's blood boiled as he surveyed the damage. This has to stop, he said, his voice low and determined. Bennett nodded. We're getting closer, but we need more. Mick's smart. He'll keep covering his tracks unless we catch him in the act. Jonathan decided to take a calculated risk. With Bennett's help, he organized a community meeting at the local nonprofit, inviting residents to share their stories and stand together against Mick. It was a dangerous move, but Jonathan knew that strength came in numbers. The turnout was larger than expected. Families packed into the small meeting hall, their faces a mix of fear and hope. Jonathan stood at the front, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. I know you're scared, he began, but fear is how people like Mick stay in power. If we stand together, we can make a difference. We can take back this neighborhood. The crowd murmured in agreement, their courage bolstered by Jonathan's words. One by one, residents began sharing their experiences, their voices rising with anger and determination. As the meeting ended, Jonathan's phone buzzed with a new message. "You've crossed the line, Reed. This isn't over." Jonathan stared at the screen, his resolve hardening. The battle against Mick was far from over, but for the first time he felt the strength of a community standing behind him. The night was restless for Jonathan. The threatening message on his phone lingered in his mind, its words etched like a warning carved in stone. He knew Mick wouldn't back down easily, but he also knew the fight was no longer just his own. The community had begun to rally, and the momentum was shifting. It was time to turn the tide. The following morning, Jonathan sat in a modest conference room at the nonprofit office, surrounded by key figures from the neighborhood. Detective Bennett was there, along with representatives from local advocacy groups, business owners, and community leaders. Even Emma had taken a seat at the table, her notebook open and ready for action. Jonathan stood at the head of the table, his voice steady but resolute. "We're here because we all want the same thing, to make this neighborhood safe again. But we can't do it alone. We need to work together." Bennett nodded, adding, "Mick's operation is big, but it's not invincible. We've already started gathering evidence, but we need more voices, more support, and more resources." One of the local business owners, a middle-aged man named Hector, spoke up. "I've seen what Mick does to people who cross him. It's not just threats, he ruins lives. How do we fight someone like that?" Jonathan met Hector's gaze, his voice firm. "We fight him by standing together. Mick thrives on fear and isolation. If we show him that this community won't be intimidated, we can take away his power." As the meeting continued, Emma found herself taking more notes than she had expected. The stories she heard were heartbreaking. Families forced out of their homes, businesses shut down, lives upended by Mick's ruthless tactics. But amidst the despair, she also saw resilience. People like Hector, who ran his corner store, despite the constant threats. Mothers like Sarah, who fought to protect their children no matter the cost. Even Tommy, who risked his safety to gather intel on Mick's gang. When the meeting ended, Emma approached her father. "You were right," she said quietly. "This isn't just about one family. It's about all of them." Jonathan placed a hand on her shoulder, pride flickering in his eyes. "I'm glad you see that, Emma. We're stronger together." Jonathan knew the battle against Mick would require more than just community support. That afternoon, he made a series of phone calls to influential friends in the city. Wealthy philanthropists, CEOs, and even a state senator he had worked with on previous initiatives. One call stood out. Sophia Chang, a tech entrepreneur and longtime friend of Jonathan's, listened intently as he explained the situation. "This sounds serious, Jonathan," Sophia said. "What do you need from me?" "Funding for legal support," Jonathan replied. "These families need representation, and we need to build a case strong enough to hold up in court." Sophia paused, then said, "I'll do more than that. I'll donate to the nonprofit and help you connect with other tech leaders who can contribute. We can't let people like Mick keep winning." Jonathan smiled, gratitude evident in his voice. "Thank you, Sophia. That means more than you know." Meanwhile, Tommy continued his undercover work, providing valuable insights into Mick's operations. With Bennett's guidance, he carefully documented everything he overheard, from the locations of cash drop-offs to the names of Mick's key enforcers. One evening, as Tommy sat at the kitchen table, scribbling notes in his notebook, Emma joined him. "Hey," she said, sitting across from him. "How are you holding up?" Tommy shrugged. "I'm okay, I guess. It's just scary sometimes. What if Mick finds out?" Emma reached across the table, her voice steady. "You're one of the bravest people I've ever met, Tommy. What you're doing is making a difference, not just for your family, but for the whole neighborhood. Tommy managed a small smile. Thanks, Emma. That means a lot. But Mick wasn't idle. As the community began to rally, his gang grew more aggressive. Businesses were vandalized, residents were harassed, and the tension in the air was palpable. One night, as Jonathan and Emma returned to the hotel, they received a frantic call from Sarah. "They're outside," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Mick's men. They're watching the building." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Stay inside. Lock the doors and windows. We'll be there as soon as we can." When they arrived, Bennett was already there with 2 patrol officers. Mick's men had dispersed, but their presence had sent a clear message. "They're trying to intimidate us," Bennett said, her expression grim. "But they're getting sloppy. We'll use this." The next day, Jonathan hosted a press conference at the nonprofit office, flanked by community leaders and residents willing to speak out. It was a bold move, but Jonathan knew the power of media attention. Emma stood beside him, holding Tommy's hand, as her father addressed the crowd of reporters. "This isn't just about one neighborhood," Jonathan said. "This is about standing up to those who use fear and violence to exploit others. We're here to say, enough is enough." The conference gained widespread attention, drawing support from activists, politicians, and even celebrities. Donations poured in, providing the nonprofit with the resources it desperately needed. But the increased visibility also came with risks. That evening, as Jonathan and Emma returned to the hotel, they found the lobby swarming with police. "What's going on?" Jonathan asked the desk clerk. "There was a break-in at your suite," the clerk replied, her voice shaken. "The police are investigating now." Upstairs, the suite was a wreck. Furniture was overturned, and papers were scattered across the floor. The message was clear. Mick wasn't just targeting the neighborhood, he was targeting Jonathan directly. Emma's face paled as she surveyed the damage. "This is getting out of control, Dad. What if he hurts someone?" Jonathan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're not backing down, Emma. He wants us to be scared, but we won't give him that power." Late that night, as Jonathan reviewed the day's progress, his phone buzzed with another message. "You've pushed too far, Reed. The next move is mine." Jonathan stared at the screen, his resolve hardening. He knew the fight against Mick was far from over, but he also knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't stop until justice was served. The air was thick with tension as dawn approached. Detective Bennett stood at the edge of the nonprofit office's conference table, a map of the neighborhood spread out before her. Jonathan and Emma were seated nearby, their expressions grave as they absorbed the details of what was about to happen. "This is it," Bennett said, her finger tracing a line on the map. "We've identified Mick's main hideout, a warehouse on the outskirts of the neighborhood. This is where he's storing the cash from his protection racket and running his other operations. If we take this place down, we cripple his entire network." Jonathan leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "And you're confident the evidence we've gathered will hold up?" Bennett nodded. "Between Tommy's intel, the community testimonies, and what we've uncovered through surveillance, we've got more than enough to secure warrants. But make no mistake, this raid won't be easy. Mick's not going to go down without a fight." Emma glanced at her father, concern etched on her face. "You're not going, right? This sounds way too dangerous." Jonathan hesitated. "I'm staying out of the action, but I'll be close by. This isn't just about taking Mick down. It's about showing the community that we're in this together." The hours leading up to the raid were a blur of activity. Bennett coordinated with her team, briefing officers and distributing assignments. Jonathan worked with the nonprofit to ensure that residents would have support in the aftermath, including temporary housing and counseling for those most affected by Mick's reign of terror. Emma, despite her initial reluctance, threw herself into the preparations. She organized supplies, coordinated with volunteers, and even spoke with reporters to keep the media's focus on the community's fight for justice. "Be careful out there," she told Bennett, as the detective prepared to leave for the operation. Bennett offered a reassuring smile. "We've got this. And thanks to you and your dad, we've got the community behind us." As night fell, the police assembled outside the warehouse, their vehicles parked strategically to block any potential escape routes. Bennett stood at the forefront, her bulletproof vest strapped tightly, as she gave final instructions to her team. Inside the warehouse, Mick and his crew were oblivious to the danger closing in. The cavernous space was cluttered with crates and stacks of cash, the spoils of their criminal enterprise. Mick lounged in a chair near the center, barking orders to his men as they counted the night's haul. The first sign of trouble came with the sound of engines revving outside. Mick's head snapped up, his sharp eyes narrowing, as he gestured for his men to check the perimeter. The raid began with a flashbang grenade, the sudden burst of light and sound, throwing Mick's crew into disarray. Officers stormed the warehouse, their commands echoing through the chaos. "Get down! Hands where we can see them!" Mick's men scrambled to fight back, but they were no match for the coordinated assault. Within minutes, most of them were subdued, their hands zip-tied as they were led out of the building. Mick, however, wasn't going down without a fight. He darted through the maze of crates, his movements quick and calculated. Bennett spotted him near the back exit and gave chase, her heart pounding as she navigated the dimly lit space. Outside, Tommy watched the raid unfold from a safe distance, his heart racing as he clutched the prepaid phone Jonathan had given him. He had insisted on being nearby, despite Jonathan's protests. As the police secured the warehouse, a commotion near the side entrance drew Tommy's attention. He saw Mick emerging, dragging a struggling figure, Lily. Tommy's blood ran cold. He didn't know how Lily had ended up there, but he didn't have time to think. Acting on pure instinct, he darted toward them, his small frame unnoticed in the chaos. "Let her go," Tommy shouted, his voice breaking through the night. Mick turned, a cruel smirk curling his lips. "Well, well, look who's playing hero." Tommy's hands trembled, but he stood his ground. "You don't scare me." For a moment, Mick seemed to consider his options. Then, with a growl of frustration, he released Lily, shoving her toward Tommy, before bolting into the darkness. Tommy caught his sister, holding her tightly as she sobbed into his chest. "It's okay, Lil," he whispered, his own tears streaming down his face. "You're safe now." By the time the dust settled, Mick's operation was in shambles. The police had confiscated stacks of cash, weapons, and incriminating documents. Several of Mick's top lieutenants were in custody, and the community had finally seen a glimmer of hope. Mick himself, however, had managed to escape. Bennett was visibly frustrated, but she refused to let it dampen the victory. "We'll get him," she promised Jonathan as they stood outside the warehouse. "It's only a matter of time." Jonathan nodded, his gaze shifting to Tommy, who was seated on the back of an ambulance with Lily by his side. "Thanks to Tommy, a lot of people are safer tonight." The days following the raid were a whirlwind of activity. The nonprofit worked tirelessly to support the families affected by Mick's crimes, providing food, clothing, and temporary shelter. Donations poured in from across the city, spurred by the media coverage of the raid. Emma, who had initially been reluctant to get involved, found herself taking a leadership role in the nonprofit's efforts. She organized a community cleanup event, rallying residents to reclaim their neighborhood from the shadows of fear and despair. "This is just the beginning," she told a group of volunteers. "We're not just cleaning up the streets, we're rebuilding hope." One evening, as Jonathan and Emma sat in the nonprofit office, their phones buzzed simultaneously. It was a message from an unknown number. "You think this is over? I'm still here, and I'm not done." Jonathan's jaw tightened as he read the message. Mick was still out there, and he wasn't going to go quietly. But Jonathan also knew one thing for certain. The community was stronger than ever, and they weren't going to let Mick, or anyone else, tear them down again. The morning after the raid was quiet, almost eerily so. The streets of the neighborhood, once dominated by Mick's menacing presence, felt different, lighter, freer. For the first time in years, residents dared to walk without glancing over their shoulders. But the scars left behind by years of oppression were still visible in every cracked sidewalk, shuttered store, and wary glance exchanged between neighbors. Jonathan stood in the middle of the nonprofit office, surveying the organized chaos around him. Volunteers bustled about, sorting donations, coordinating with city agencies, and preparing for the community meeting that would take place later that day. "This is where the real work begins," he said quietly to Emma, who stood beside him with a clipboard in hand. Emma nodded, her gaze scanning the room. "It's overwhelming, but I think we're actually making a difference." Jonathan placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression proud. "That's the goal." Jonathan's first priority was ensuring Sarah, Tommy, and Lily had a safe place to stay. With the nonprofit's help, he secured a small, furnished apartment in a better part of the neighborhood. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, warm, and, most importantly, safe. The day they moved in, Sarah stood in the middle of the living room, her eyes glistening with tears. "I don't even know how to thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't have to," Jonathan replied with a gentle smile. "You've been through enough. It's time for things to get better." Tommy, standing nearby, looked around the apartment with a mix of relief and disbelief. "This is amazing. Lily finally has her own rooms." Lily, clutching her stuffed bear, beamed as she explored her new space. "It's so big," she exclaimed, her voice filled with pure joy. Emma knelt beside her, helping her arrange the few toys she had on the shelves. "You deserve this, Lily," she said softly. "And so does your family." The community meeting that evening was held in a local church, its pews packed with residents eager to discuss the future. Jonathan stood at the front, flanked by Emma and Detective Bennett. The air was charged with a mix of hope and uncertainty. "Last night was a turning point," Jonathan began, his voice carrying through the room. "But it's only the first step. Mick might be gone, but the damage he caused won't disappear overnight. It's up to all of us to rebuild. Together." The room erupted into murmurs, some voices expressing doubt, while others voiced support. Hector, the corner store owner, stood up. "Jonathan's right. For too long, we've been scared to stand up for ourselves. But we're stronger than we think. We just proved that." Another resident, a middle-aged woman named Rosa, raised her hand. "But what happens if Mick comes back? We can't let our guard down." Bennett stepped forward. "We're not done. The investigation is ongoing, and we're working to track Mick down. But we need your help. If you see something, say something. This is your neighborhood, and you have the power to protect it." The meeting ended with a renewed sense of purpose. Residents volunteered to form neighborhood watch groups, while others pledged to support local businesses and community events. In the days that followed, Emma took on an increasingly active role in the nonprofit. She organized donation drives, coordinated with city officials, and even started a mentorship program for local youth. One afternoon, as she supervised a group of children painting a mural on the side of a building, Tommy approached her. "You're pretty good at this," he said with a grin. Emma laughed. "I had a good teacher," she replied, glancing toward her father, who was helping a group of volunteers unload supplies nearby. Tommy's expression turned serious. "Thanks for everything, Emma. You and your dad. You've changed everything for us." Emma placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've done just as much, Tommy. Don't forget that." Despite the progress, the threat of Mick's return loomed large. Bennett received reports of his men regrouping in nearby neighborhoods, and the messages Jonathan had been receiving continued to grow more menacing. One evening, as Jonathan reviewed plans for a new community center, his phone buzzed with another message. "You can build all you want, but this is still my turf. See you soon." Jonathan stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. He knew Mick wouldn't give up easily, but he also knew the community was stronger now. They wouldn't go back to living in fear. To rally support and celebrate the progress made, Jonathan and the nonprofit organized a fundraising gala at a local event hall. The room was filled with community members, city officials, and donors, all coming together to show their commitment to the neighborhood's future. Tommy was the star of the evening. Dressed in a crisp new suit, he took the stage to share his story. "A few weeks ago I thought there was no way out," he began, his voice steady despite the crowd. "But, thanks to people like Mr. Reed, Detective Bennett, and everyone here, I see things differently now. This isn't just about surviving anymore. It's about living, and we all deserve that." The room erupted into applause, and Jonathan couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. As he looked around, he saw the faces of people who had once been strangers, but were now united by a common purpose. As the gala wound down, Jonathan stepped outside to take a call. The air was cool, and the street was quiet. Too quiet. He turned to head back inside when a car pulled up, its engine idling as the window rolled down. A familiar face emerged, Mick, his cold eyes locking onto Jonathan. "Enjoy your little party, Reed," he sneered, "because it's the last one you'll have." Before Jonathan could respond, the car sped off, leaving him standing in the street, his heart pounding. He knew the battle was far from over, but he also knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to back down. The atmosphere at the gala was electric, a palpable energy radiating through the grand hall, as residents, donors, and supporters came together to celebrate the community's progress. The venue, a refurbished historic building in the heart of Harlem, was adorned with lights and decorations that reflected the neighborhood's resilience and vibrancy. Jonathan stood near the entrance, greeting guests with a warm smile. Dressed in a tailored suit, he exuded confidence, but his eyes occasionally darted to the corners of the room. The recent encounter with Mick still lingered in his mind. Tonight was a celebration, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was looming. Emma appeared at his side, her emerald dress shimmering under the soft glow of the chandeliers. "Dad, relax," she said, sensing his unease. "This is a good thing. Look around. People are here because of what we've accomplished." Jonathan's gaze swept the room, taking in the sight of families mingling with city officials, young children darting between tables, and residents exchanging laughter and stories. He nodded, a small smile breaking through. "You're right. This is their night." As the evening progressed, the program began. A local jazz band provided a soulful backdrop. As attendees took their seats, the buzz of conversation settling into quiet anticipation. Emma stepped onto the stage first, her presence commanding yet approachable. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice steady. Tonight, we're not just here to celebrate what we've achieved. We're here to remind ourselves of what's possible when we come together. She spoke about the neighborhood's transformation, the collective efforts of the residents, and the vision for a future where everyone had the opportunity to thrive. Her words were met with enthusiastic applause, her passion igniting a spark in the room. Next, it was Tommy's turn. Dressed in a sharp suit, he approached the podium with a mix of nerves and determination. "A few months ago," he began, his voice faltering slightly, "I thought my family and I were stuck. I thought there was no way out of the life we were living." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "But then people like Mr. Reed, Detective Bennett, and all of you showed me that there's hope, that things can change. And now, I'm standing here, telling you that this is just the beginning. We can't stop now." The audience erupted in applause, many rising to their feet in a standing ovation. Emma wiped a tear from her eye, her pride for Tommy evident. As the applause died down and the band resumed playing, Jonathan made his way to the back of the room, his phone buzzing with a message. He stepped into a quiet hallway to check it. The message was from an unknown number. "You think tonight changes anything? You're playing a game you can't win." Jonathan's jaw tightened as he stared at the screen. Mick was clearly watching, but how close was he? He glanced around the hallway, his eyes scanning for anything out of place. Taking a deep breath, he composed himself and returned to the main hall, determined not to let Mick ruin the night. As the gala neared its conclusion, Jonathan took the stage to deliver his closing remarks. "Tonight, we've seen the power of community," he said, his voice resonating through the hall. "We've seen what happens when people refuse to give in to fear, and instead choose to stand together." His words were met with cheers, but as he continued, a commotion at the entrance drew the crowd's attention. The doors swung open, and Mick strode in, flanked by two of his men. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Jonathan stepped forward, his posture calm but firm. "Mick," he said, his voice steady, "you're not welcome here." Mick smirked, his eyes scanning the room. "Nice party, Reed. Thought I'd stop by and see what all the fuss is about." Jonathan held his ground. "This is a celebration of hope and progress, something you've spent years trying to destroy." Mick's smirk faltered, replaced by a sneer. "You think you've won? This neighborhood still belongs to me." The room erupted into murmurs, but Jonathan raised a hand, silencing the crowd. "Not anymore," he said firmly. "This community has taken back its power, and we're not going to let you take it away again." Mick took a step closer, his voice low and menacing. "You're playing with fire, Reed, and people who play with fire usually get burned." Before Mick could say more, Detective Bennett stepped forward, flanked by two uniformed officers. "That's enough, Mick," she said, her tone sharp. "You're trespassing. Leave now, or we'll escort you out." For a moment, Mick seemed to consider his options. Then he smirked again, his confidence unshaken. "This isn't over," he said, his gaze lingering on Jonathan. "Not by a long shot." As Mick and his men left, the room remained silent, the tension thick. Jonathan turned back to the crowd, his voice calm but resolute. "This is what we're up against. But tonight proves that we're stronger than fear, stronger than threats, and together we will win." The crowd erupted into applause, their spirits reignited by Jonathan's words. After the gala, Jonathan, Emma, and Bennett met in the nonprofit office to debrief. The encounter with Mick had rattled them, but it had also solidified their resolve. "We're close," Bennett said, spreading out files on the table. "The evidence we gathered during the raid is enough to shut down his operation. Now, We just need to find him. Jonathan nodded, his expression grim. He's not going to stop until we do. Let's make it happen. Meanwhile, Emma worked with the nonprofit team to channel the momentum from the gala into tangible action. She organized additional community events, expanded the youth mentorship program, and launched a new initiative to support local businesses. This is how we fight back, she told the team during a meeting. By building something stronger than what Mick tried to destroy. Late one night, as Jonathan and Emma prepared to leave the office, Jonathan's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message. It was a video. He hesitated before pressing play, his stomach tightening as the screen lit up. The video showed Mick, standing in what appeared to be an abandoned building. "You think you've beaten me, Reed?" he said, his voice calm but dripping with malice. "This isn't over. And the next move is mine." The video cut off, leaving Jonathan staring at the screen, his mind racing. He knew Mick was planning something big, and whatever it was, it would test everything they had worked for. The video haunted Jonathan. Every frame replayed in his mind as he stared out the window of the nonprofit office, the city lights casting a soft glow over the bustling streets. Mick was planning something, and it wasn't just another threat. It was a promise. Detective Bennett paced the room, her jaw clenched in frustration. "We're so close," she muttered, her voice tight. "We've dismantled his operation, arrested most of his crew, and cut off his income. But Mick is still out there, and he's not going to disappear quietly." Emma, seated at the table with a laptop open in front of her, looked up. "We need to find him before he finds us." Jonathan turned to Bennett. "What's our best lead?" Bennett sighed, running a hand through her hair. "We're tracking his movements, but he's careful. The video gives us a clue. It looks like he's holed up in one of the abandoned buildings near the old rail yard. We're working on confirming it." Jonathan nodded, his expression grim. "Let's finish this." The next morning, the nonprofit office was a hive of activity. Volunteers bustled about, organizing supplies and coordinating with city officials to address the needs of the community. Despite the looming threat, the atmosphere was one of determination and hope. Emma took charge of the youth mentorship program, her confidence growing with each passing day. She worked closely with Tommy, who had become a role model for the younger kids. Together, they planned a community event to celebrate the neighborhood's resilience. "You're doing great, Tommy," Emma said, as they hung banners in the park. "I'm proud of you." Tommy shrugged, a shy smile tugging at his lips. "I'm just doing what I can." Nearby, Sarah watched her son with a mixture of pride and worry. She approached Jonathan, her voice low. "Do you think it's really over?" Jonathan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Not yet, but we're close. And when it's over, your family will finally have peace." That evening, Bennett gathered her team for a briefing at the precinct. Jonathan and Emma joined them, their presence a reminder of the community's stake in the outcome. "We've confirmed Mick's location," Bennett announced, pointing to a map on the wall. "He's using an abandoned warehouse near the rail yard as his base. We've secured a warrant to raid the site, but we need to move quickly." "What's the plan?" Jonathan asked. "We'll surround the building and cut off all exits," Bennett explained. "Our goal is to apprehend Mick and any remaining members of his crew. It's going to be dangerous, but we're prepared." Jonathan nodded. "I want to be there." Bennett hesitated. "It's too risky." "I'm not asking to go inside," Jonathan said firmly. "But I need to be there for the community. They need to know we're in this together." After a moment, Bennett relented. "Fine. But stay out of the way." The rail yard was eerily silent As the police assembled under the cover of darkness, the warehouse loomed ahead, its broken windows and rusted walls, a testament to years of neglect. Officers moved into position, their radios crackling softly as they communicated. Jonathan and Emma watched from a safe distance, their hearts pounding. Nearby, Tommy and Sarah stood with a group of neighbors who had come to show their support. Inside the warehouse, Mick and his remaining crew were unaware of the trap closing in around them. Mick paced the room, his expression tense as he barked orders. "We're not done yet. They think they've won, but we're still here." The raid began with a deafening flashbang, the burst of light and sound, sending Mick's crew into chaos. Officers stormed the building, their commands cutting through the air. "Get down! Hands where we can see them!" Mick's men scrambled to fight back, but they were quickly overwhelmed. Mick, however, made a break for the back exit, his mind racing as he searched for a way out. Bennett spotted Mick as he slipped out the back and gave chase, her heart pounding as she pursued him through the rail yard. The terrain was treacherous, littered with debris and overgrown with weeds. Mick was fast, but Bennett was determined. Jonathan, unable to stay still, moved closer to the scene with Emma by his side. "Dad, be careful," Emma urged, her voice filled with worry. "I just need to see this through," Jonathan replied, his eyes fixed on the commotion ahead. Mick's escape was cut short when he stumbled, his foot catching on a piece of metal. Bennett closed the gap, her gun trained on him. "It's over, Mick. Don't make this worse." Mick glared at her, his chest heaving. "You think you've won. This neighborhood will always be mine." "Not anymore," Bennett said, her voice firm. "You're under arrest." The news of Mick's arrest spread quickly, bringing a sense of relief to the neighborhood. The warehouse raid had not only dismantled the last remnants of his operation, but also sent a clear message. The community was no longer afraid. At the nonprofit office, Jonathan addressed a crowd of residents and supporters. "This victory isn't just about taking down one man," he said. "It's about reclaiming our home and proving that together we're unstoppable." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices echoing through the streets. Emma stood beside her father, her heart swelling with pride as she looked out at the faces of the people they had fought for. As the celebration continued, Jonathan's phone buzzed with a call from Bennett. He stepped away from the crowd, his expression turning serious as he listened. "Jonathan, we've got a problem," Bennett said. "During the raid, we found evidence that Mick wasn't working alone. There's someone bigger pulling the strings." Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened. "Who?" Bennett's voice was grave. "We're still figuring that out. But this isn't over." Jonathan looked back at the crowd, his resolve hardening. The fight wasn't finished, but he knew one thing for sure. They wouldn't back down. The streets of the neighborhood were bathed in the golden light of early morning, a stark contrast to the tense, shadowed days they had endured. The air felt lighter, the silence no longer oppressive, but peaceful. Mick was behind bars, and the community was beginning to heal. Yet for Jonathan and the team, this was not the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter. In the weeks following Mick's arrest, Jonathan made good on his promise to Sarah, Tommy, and Lily. The new apartment had become their sanctuary, a place where laughter replaced fear, and hope began to flourish. Jonathan visited them often, bringing small gifts for Lily and updates on the neighborhood's progress. On one visit, he arrived with a stack of books for Tommy. "These are for your studies," he said, handing the boy the carefully selected collection. Tommy's eyes lit up as he leafed through the pages. "Thanks, Mr. Reed. I've been thinking maybe I could go to college someday. Help other kids like me." Jonathan smiled, placing a hand on Tommy's shoulder. You can do anything you set your mind to, and I'll be here to help you every step of the way. In the kitchen, Sarah busied herself preparing tea, a sense of calm in her movements that had been absent for years. I can't thank you enough, she said softly, for everything. You don't have to, Jonathan replied. Seeing you and your family thrive is all the thanks I need. At the nonprofit office, Emma had fully embraced her role, stepping into leadership with a confidence that surprised even herself. She organized events, managed volunteers, and spearheaded new initiatives aimed at empowering the youth in the neighborhood. One afternoon, as she reviewed proposals for a community mentorship program, Jonathan entered the office with 2 cups of coffee. Thought you could use a break, he said, setting one on her desk. Emma looked up with a tired smile. Thanks, Dad. It's been a busy day. Jonathan sat across from her, watching as she juggled emails and phone calls. You've really stepped up, he said, pride evident in his voice. The work you're doing here, it's incredible. Emma paused, her expression softening. I learned from the best. But honestly, Dad, this feels right, like I'm finally doing something that matters. Jonathan reached out, taking her hand. You are. And I couldn't be prouder. The neighborhood began to transform. With mixed hole broken, local businesses reopened, and families returned to the streets without fear. The nonprofit, fueled by donations and support from Jonathan's network, launched several new projects: a youth center, job training programs, and a community garden. Hector, the corner store owner, hosted a grand reopening with the help of the community. As neighbors gathered to celebrate, Jonathan and Emma joined the festivities, mingling with the crowd and soaking in the renewed sense of unity. This is what we've been fighting for, Emma said, watching children play on the freshly painted sidewalks. Jonathan nodded, his gaze lingering on the scene. It's just the beginning. There's still so much to do. Despite the progress, the discovery of mixed larger connections weighed heavily on Jonathan and Bennett. The evidence uncovered during the raid pointed to a shadowy figure funding Mick's operation, someone with deeper pockets and a more sinister agenda. One evening, Bennett met Jonathan at the nonprofit office, spreading out files on the table. We've traced some of the money, she said. It's tied to a shell corporation based overseas. Whoever's behind this has resources we can't even begin to comprehend. Jonathan frowned, his mind racing. Do you think they'll come after the neighborhood? Bennett hesitated before answering. I don't know, but we need to stay vigilant. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his resolve hardening. Then let's keep digging. If there's a larger threat, we need to be ready. To mark the neighborhood's progress, Emma organized a community event in the park. The day was filled with music, food, and activities for all ages, a celebration of resilience and hope. Jonathan took the stage to address the crowd, his voice carrying over the sea of faces. Today we celebrate not just what we've overcome, but what we've built together. This community is a testament to the power of unity, and I'm honored to stand with all of you. The crowd erupted into cheers, their applause a symbol of their collective strength. Emma watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride as she saw the impact of their work. That evening, as the sun set over the city, Jonathan and Emma returned to the nonprofit office. They sat in the quiet, the events of the day replaying in their minds. You know, Emma began, breaking the silence. I used to think you were crazy for doing all of this. But now, I get it. It's not just about helping others. It's about finding purpose. Jonathan smiled, his eyes glistening with emotion. It took me a long time to realize that too. But once you do, there's no turning back. Emma nodded, her expression thoughtful. "What's next?" Jonathan leaned back, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Whatever it takes to keep this momentum going. This is just the beginning." As they prepared to leave, Jonathan's phone buzzed with a new message. The sender was unknown, but the message was clear. "You've won this round, Reed. But the game isn't over." Jonathan stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. Whoever was behind Mick's operation was still out there, and they weren't going to back down. But neither was he. "We'll be ready," he said quietly, slipping his phone into his pocket. Emma glanced at him, her expression determined. "We've come this far. We're not stopping now." Together, they stepped out into the night, the city lights shining like beacons of hope against the darkness. The neighborhood buzzed with activity in the weeks following the celebration. The streets, once shadowed by fear and oppression, now rang with the sounds of children playing, families laughing, and community members rebuilding what had been broken. Yet, for Jonathan, the journey wasn't over. Each step forward brought new challenges, new questions, and deeper reflection on the lessons learned along the way. The Youth Mentorship Program had become one of the nonprofit's flagship initiatives, empowering young people to take charge of their futures. Emma, who had grown into a respected leader within the organization, was invited to speak at a citywide conference on community development. Standing at the podium in a large auditorium, Emma felt the weight of the moment. The audience was filled with city officials, nonprofit leaders, and activists eager to hear her perspective. She began, her voice steady but heartfelt. "When I first came to this neighborhood, I didn't understand it. I saw the struggles, the fear, and the challenges, but I didn't truly see the people. It wasn't until I got involved, really involved, that I realized how much strength, resilience, and hope existed here." Emma shared stories of Tommy, Lily, and other young people whose lives had been transformed through the program. "This isn't just about fixing what's broken," she said. "It's about building something better. And that starts with believing in the power of community." Her speech ended with a standing ovation, her words resonating deeply with everyone in the room. Jonathan, watching from the audience, felt a swell of pride. His daughter had found her voice, and it was inspiring change. Meanwhile, Tommy had embraced his role as a mentor to other kids in the neighborhood. He spent afternoons at the youth center, helping younger children with homework, teaching them basketball, and sharing his own story. One day, as he worked on a science project with a group of kids, one of them asked, "Tommy, do you ever get scared?" Tommy paused, considering the question. "Yeah, I do," he admitted. "But being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you keep going even when you are." The kids listened intently, their eyes wide with admiration. For them, Tommy wasn't just a mentor. He was proof that change was possible. Later that evening, Tommy confided in Jonathan. "I never thought I'd be doing something like this," he said. "It feels good." Jonathan smiled, placing a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "That's because you're making a difference, and that's the best feeling in the world." Amid the progress, Jonathan found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. He often walked through the neighborhood, stopping to talk with residents, visit local businesses, and observe the changes taking place. One afternoon, as he stood in front of the newly painted mural on the community center, he was joined by Sarah. "This place feels different," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "It's like hope is finally taking root." Jonathan nodded. "That's because of people like you, Sarah. People who refuse to give up, even when things seemed impossible." Sarah smiled, her expression thoughtful. "And because of people like you. You didn't have to do any of this. But you did. Why? Jonathan looked at her, his gaze steady. Because it was the right thing to do. And because I've learned that real happiness doesn't come from what you have. It comes from what you give. As the neighborhood stabilized, Jonathan began to look beyond its borders. He partnered with city officials and other nonprofits to replicate their success in other struggling communities. His vision was ambitious, to create a network of safe, thriving neighborhoods across the city. At a strategy meeting with his team, Jonathan outlined the plan. "We've proven that change is possible," he said. "Now, it's time to scale that impact. This isn't just about one neighborhood. It's about creating a model that can inspire change everywhere." Emma chimed in, her enthusiasm infectious. "And we're starting right here, with the people who made this possible. We're going to show the world what a united community can achieve." Despite the progress, the shadow of Mick's operation lingered. Bennett continued to investigate the larger network behind Mick, uncovering ties to powerful figures with resources that far exceeded anything they had faced before. One evening, as Jonathan worked late at the nonprofit office, Bennett called with an update. "We've identified the source of the funding," she said. "It's a syndicate with deep connections to organized crime. They're not happy about what we've done." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Are we in danger?" "Not immediate danger," Bennett replied. "But we need to stay vigilant. They're not going to let this go without a fight." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He knew the battle wasn't over, but he also knew they couldn't stop now. As the investigation continued, the neighborhood banded together, determined to protect what they had built. Residents formed watch groups, organized fundraisers, and supported one another in ways that had once seemed impossible. At a town hall meeting, Hector stood up to speak. "We've come too far to let fear take over again," he said. "This is our home, and we're not going to let anyone take it from us." The room erupted into applause, the collective resolve of the community shining through. To commemorate the neighborhood's transformation, Emma organized a ceremony to dedicate the newly renovated park. The event included speeches, performances by local artists, and the unveiling of a plaque honoring the community's resilience. Jonathan was the last to speak, his voice filled with emotion. "This plaque isn't just a symbol of what we've achieved. It's a reminder of what we're capable of. Together, we've proven that change is possible, and that no challenge is too great when we stand united." The crowd cheered, their spirits lifted by his words. Emma stood beside him, her heart swelling with pride as she looked out at the people who had become like family. As the ceremony came to an end, and the crowd dispersed, Jonathan's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an unknown number, but the words were chilling. "You've built something beautiful. Let's see how long it lasts." Jonathan stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. The fight wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. Emma noticed his expression and placed a hand on his arm. "What is it, Dad?" Jonathan looked at her, determination in his eyes. "Just another reminder of why we can't stop now." Together, they left the park, the lights of the city shining brightly against the night sky, a symbol of hope, resilience, and the lessons learned along the way. The morning air was crisp, filled with the hum of a city waking to another day. For Jonathan, this day felt different. It marked not just the culmination of months of work, but the beginning of something larger. He stood on the steps of the community center, watching as residents arrived for the event that would symbolize their collective journey. Inside the community center, Tommy adjusted his tie nervously. He was scheduled to speak today. His role as a symbol of resilience and hope solidified in the eyes of the neighborhood. Emma found him in the back room, fidgeting with the knot. "Need some help?" she asked, a playful smile on her lips Tommy nodded, his hands dropping to his sides. I still can't believe I'm doing this. A year ago, I was just a kid trying to survive. Emma straightened his tie, her movements careful. And now, you're someone who inspires others. You've earned this, Tommy. He glanced at her, his expression softening. Thanks, Emma, for everything. The event was held in the center's main hall, its walls adorned with artwork created by local kids. A stage had been set up at the front, flanked by banners that read, "A new chapter, building together." Jonathan opened the ceremony, his voice calm but filled with conviction. When we started this journey, we faced fear, doubt, and challenges that seemed insurmountable. But together, we proved that change is possible. Today, we celebrate not just what we've achieved, but what lies ahead. The crowd applauded, their faces a mix of pride and hope. Next, Emma took the stage, her speech focusing on the power of community and the importance of investing in the next generation. When it was Tommy's turn, the room fell silent. He stepped up to the podium, his hands gripping the edges nervously. But as he began to speak, his voice grew steadier, more confident. I used to think my life would never change, he said. But people believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. They showed me that no matter how hard things get, there's always hope. And now, I want to do the same for others. His words were met with a standing ovation, the applause echoing through the hall. Jonathan and Emma exchanged a glance, their hearts swelling with pride. After the ceremony, Jonathan gathered with key members of the nonprofit to discuss their next steps. The neighborhood's transformation had inspired other communities, and requests for support were pouring in from across the city. We've started something incredible here, Jonathan said. But this is just the beginning. If we can do this in one neighborhood, we can do it everywhere. Emma nodded, her determination evident. Let's make it happen. As the event wound down, Jonathan stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. He turned to find Detective Bennett approaching, her expression serious. We've got news, she said. The syndicate behind Mick's operation, they're watching. But we've also got allies stepping up. This fight isn't over, but we're ready. Jonathan nodded, his resolve unwavering. Whatever it takes, we'll face it. Later that evening, Jonathan and Emma visited Tommy and his family at their apartment. The room was filled with laughter as Lily showed off a drawing she'd made for Jonathan, depicting him as a superhero. You've got talent, Lily, Jonathan said, his tone warm. Maybe one day you'll be an artist. Lily beamed, her eyes shining with joy. Tommy sat nearby, flipping through a stack of college brochures. I've been thinking about this a lot, he said. I want to study social work. I want to help kids like me. Jonathan's smile widened. That's a perfect choice, Tommy. And we'll support you every step of the way. As they left the apartment, Emma turned to Jonathan. Dad, I've been thinking about expanding the nonprofit, creating programs that focus on education and mentorship in other neighborhoods. Jonathan paused, his gaze thoughtful. That's a big step. Emma nodded. I know, but it feels right. This isn't just about fixing problems. It's about building futures. Jonathan placed a hand on her shoulder, his pride evident. Then let's do it. Together. Months later, the nonprofit hosted a gala at City Hall, celebrating its expansion into 3 additional neighborhoods. The event was a culmination of everything they had worked for, a testament to the power of resilience and unity. Tommy, now a freshman in college, gave a moving speech about his journey, bringing many in the audience to tears. Emma, officially leading the nonprofit's youth mentorship division, presented plans for further growth. Jonathan closed the evening with a heartfelt message. This isn't just a story about one neighborhood. It's about what we can achieve when we refuse to give up, when we believe in each other and work together. The crowd erupted into applause, their enthusiasm filling the grand hall. Years later, Tommy stood in the same community center where it had all begun. Now, a social worker, he was mentoring a group of young kids, just as he had once been mentored. On the wall behind him hung a plaque honoring Jonathan's contributions to the neighborhood. Emma, now the director of the nonprofit, watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with pride. She thought of her father, who had dedicated his life to making the world a better place. As the sun set over the city, its light casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, Emma whispered to herself, "We did it." The legacy of hope and resilience continued, a reminder that even in the darkest times, a single act of kindness could change the world. As the story comes to a close, we're reminded of the incredible power of hope, resilience, and the connections we build with one another. But what about you? What would you have done if you were in Jonathan's shoes, or Emma's? How do you think you'd react if faced with the challenges they overcame? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters and could inspire someone else watching today. And if this story moved you, there's so much more to come. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to be the first to catch our next journey. Another tale that will touch your heart, challenge your beliefs, and remind you of the beauty in humanity. Until then, take care, stay kind, and we'll see you in the next story. Love.